The story of Samson begins long before his birth. In a dark period in Israel's history, when everyone did what was right in their own eyes and the people were oppressed by the Philistines, God decided to raise up a deliverer in a completely unexpected way. The answer would come through the womb of a barren woman. Her name is not mentioned in the scriptures, but her faith would change the destiny of an entire nation. One day, as she was going about her usual tasks, the angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, "You are barren and childless, but you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son." Judges 13:3. The divine encounter shook her deeply. The angel continued, explaining that the child would be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the womb. He was not to drink wine, not to eat anything unclean, and he was never to have his hair cut. This child was to be different, separated, chosen, set apart. The woman quickly ran to her husband Manoah and told him everything. Together they prayed that the messenger would return and guide them more clearly. God heard their prayer. The angel returned. Manoah, filled with awe and caution, asked him, "What is to be the rule that governs the boy's life and work?" The answer was clear. Raise him with obedience, holiness, and devotion. Maybe the woman's heart beat faster when she felt the first movement of the child inside her. Maybe she cried, realizing that God had heard her silent cry, the one no one else knew. When the boy was born, they named him Samson, which means little son, a name full of hope, a sign of light in a time of darkness, a reminder that God had not forgotten his people. The boy grew, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. Judges 13:24-25. Have you ever wondered if God might be preparing something powerful right at the moment when your life feels the most barren? When your dreams seem buried, your plans dead, and heaven silent? That might be when God is about to move. Samson wasn't just a strong man. He was a living miracle, and his story was only just beginning. Samson grew up knowing he was chosen. He had strength no one else had, and he began to feel the weight of being different. As he got older, his desires grew stronger, and so did his impulsiveness. One day, while walking in the city of Timnah, he saw a young Philistine woman. She caught his attention immediately. He returned home and told his parents, "I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." Judges 14:2. His parents were shocked. They tried to convince him otherwise. "Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people?" They reminded him she was from the enemy, the uncircumcised Philistines. But Samson wouldn't listen. "She's the right one for me," he insisted. Samson wasn't thinking about God's command to remain set apart. He wasn't thinking about covenant or calling. He was thinking about what pleased his eyes. But God would still use even that flawed decision to begin his plan. His parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines. Judges 14:4. As Samson went down to Timnah again, a young lion suddenly attacked him. He had no weapon, no one was around, but the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands. He didn't tell anyone. He just kept walking as if nothing had happened. Later, when he returned for the wedding, he walked past the lion's carcass and noticed something strange. Bees had made a hive inside the lion's body, and it was full of honey. He reached in, took the honey, and ate it. He even gave some to his parents, but didn't tell them where it came from. At the wedding feast, Samson posed a riddle to 30 Philistine men. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. Judges 14:14. They had no idea what he was talking about. After 3 days of trying, they threatened Samson's wife, saying they would burn her and her father's household if she didn't get the answer from him. Under pressure, she cried and begged him for days. Eventually, Samson gave in and told her the secret. She told the Philistines. They answered the riddle. Samson knew he had been betrayed. Angry, he left the wedding, went to the city of Ashkelon, killed 30 men and took their clothes to pay off his debt from the wager. Then he stormed back home without his wife. When he returned later, he discovered that she had been given to another man, his own best man. Samson's heart began to harden. His first love ended in betrayal and humiliation. Maybe that's when he stopped believing in love at all. Maybe that's when he started to trust no one but himself. This moment was more than a personal heartbreak. It was the beginning of a pattern, a man called to lead, now led by anger. A man set apart, now chasing what was forbidden. Have you ever gone after something that looked good but wasn't from God? Have you ever ignored wise counsel because you were focused on what pleased you? Samson did, and it cost him more than he expected. But this was only the beginning of what would become a dangerous spiral, one choice at a time. Samson had not just lost a wife, he had lost something deeper, a sense of boundaries. He felt humiliated, angry and wounded, and instead of seeking God, he chose revenge. He returned to Timnah to visit his wife, only to discover that she had been given to another man. Her father told him, "I was so sure you hated her that I gave her to your companion. Isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead." Judges 15:2. That insult pushed Samson over the edge. He said, "This time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them." He went out and caught 300 foxes, tied them in pairs by their tails, and fastened a burning torch between each pair. Then he released the foxes into the Philistine grain fields, vineyards and olive groves. Fire spread rapidly. Crops were destroyed, livelihoods ruined. A whole season of harvest was turned to ash. The Philistines were furious. They retaliated, not against Samson directly, but against his former wife and her family. They burned them alive. The chain of violence had begun. One action led to another, each more brutal than the last. Samson responded again with blood. He struck down many Philistines and then retreated to a cave in the rock of Etam. But the Philistines were not done. They marched into Judah, Samson's own territory, and demanded that he be handed over. The men of Judah were terrified. Instead of defending their leader, they turned on him. 3,000 men from Judah went up to the cave and told Samson, "Don't you realize the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us?" Samson agreed to go with them, but only if they promised not to kill him themselves. They tied him with 2 new ropes and handed him over. As he approached the Philistines, they began to shout in triumph. But suddenly, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Judges 15:14. He saw the jawbone of a donkey, picked it up, and used it to strike down 1,000 men. After the battle, exhausted and thirsty, Samson cried out to God, "You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" God opened a hollow place, and water flowed from it. Samson drank, and his strength returned. He judged Israel for 20 years after that, but cracks in his character remained. He was powerful on the outside, but inside, he still struggled. Maybe you can relate. Maybe you've seen public victories while feeling empty inside. Maybe you've served God outwardly, but ignored the quiet voice inside calling you back. Samson had defeated many enemies, but not the one inside himself. Until we confront our internal battles, the real collapse is only a matter of time. Even after all that had happened, Samson still hadn't learned. He continued living by impulse. His physical strength was still intact, but his spiritual strength was wearing thin. He was strong in body but weak in discipline. One day, Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. Judges 16:1. Gaza was a major Philistine city. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to satisfy his desires. This time the enemy didn't need to come to him. He walked straight into their territory, into their trap. Word spread quickly. The Philistines learned Samson was in the city and surrounded the place where he was staying. They waited quietly at the city gate, planning to attack him at dawn. But Samson left in the middle of the night. Instead of slipping away quietly, he did something dramatic. He lifted the city gates, along with their posts and crossbar, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of a hill facing Hebron. It was a message: you can't lock me in, you can't trap me. For a moment it looked like he was unstoppable. He was still winning, still powerful, but that victory was only on the outside. Inside, Samson was already enslaved, not by iron chains, but by his own belief that he could live however he wanted and still expect God to back him up. He thought his strength was permanent, that no matter what he did, God would still be with him. He carried gates on his back, but inside, his heart was chained. Then Delilah appeared. Sometime later, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah, Judges 16:4. Her name meant delicate or soft. But behind that softness was a dangerous agenda. The Philistine rulers saw an opportunity. They went to Delilah with an offer. See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength, and we will each give you 1,100 shekels of silver. Delilah agreed. She began her approach. She looked like love, but she was a trap. She asked, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." Samson lied. "If I'm tied with 7 fresh bowstrings, I'll become as weak as any other man." She tied him. The Philistines hid in the room. She shouted, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He snapped the cords easily. Delilah acted upset. She begged again. He told another lie. "If I'm tied with new ropes that have never been used." Same outcome. He broke free. A third time, she asked. He said, "If you weave my 7 braids into the fabric on the loom." Each time he got closer to the truth. He knew Delilah was not safe. He knew she had tried to betray him 3 times, and yet he stayed. Why? Because when you play with sin long enough, you start believing it won't really destroy you. You think you're in control, but you're not. Samson thought he was winning, but each compromise was taking him closer to the edge. He wasn't conquered by strength, he was undone by seduction and pride, and soon he would cross a line, one that couldn't be undone. Delilah didn't give up. Day after day, she asked Samson the same question. She used her voice, her touch, her emotions. She guilted him. She cried. She questioned his love. "How can you say, 'I love you,' when you won't confide in me?" she said. Judges 16:15. Samson was under constant pressure. The Bible says, with such nagging she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. Judges 16:16. Finally, he gave in. He told her everything. He didn't tell another riddle. He didn't play games this time. He opened up, not to someone trustworthy, but to someone already working against him. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazirite, dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." Judges 16:17. This wasn't just a personal detail. This was a vow. It was the final visible sign of his lifelong dedication to God. By revealing it and allowing it to be broken, Samson was not just risking his strength, he was walking away from the identity God had given him. Delilah immediately knew he was telling the truth this time. She called the Philistine rulers. "Come back once more, he has told me everything." And they returned, silver in hand. Delilah lulled Samson to sleep on her lap. She called for someone to shave off his 7 braids. While he slept, the final sign of his calling fell to the floor. Hair that had never been cut, a symbol of obedience, was gone. Then she shouted, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He woke up thinking it would be like before. "I'll go out as before and shake myself free." But the next verse is one of the saddest in all of Scripture. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Judges 16:20. The issue wasn't the haircut. It was that the presence of God, the real source of his strength, had departed. The Philistines seized him. They gouged out his eyes. They took him to Gaza. They bound him with bronze shackles, and they made him grind grain in prison, like a beast of burden. The man who once lifted city gates on his shoulders was now pushing a millstone in circles, blind, broken, alone. But the story doesn't end there. but the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Judges 16:22. It's a small detail, but it matters because it shows something was starting to return. God hadn't given up on Samson. Maybe today you feel like Samson. You've lost vision. You're bound. You've surrendered what was sacred. But if your heart is willing, God is still able. If you're breathing, He's not finished with you yet. Time passed. Days turned into weeks. The man who once ruled battlefields now walked in circles, grinding grain, blind and chained in prison. Samson had fallen. He wasn't a leader anymore. He wasn't a warrior. He was a joke, a prisoner of the very people he was supposed to conquer. But the greatest transformation wasn't happening outside. It was happening inside, in the silence, in the dark. Alone with his regrets and his pain. Samson had always been physically strong, but now his strength was gone. He had always been proud, now he was humiliated. He had always acted impulsively, but now he had time to think. And in that long silence, something shifted. The verse is quiet, but powerful. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Judges 16:22. His strength wasn't in the hair itself. It was in the vow the hair represented. And even though Samson had broken that vow, God had not broken his mercy. The Philistines thought the danger was over. They thought Samson was finished. They were wrong. The Philistine leaders decided to hold a massive celebration in the temple of their god, Dagon. It was a public holiday, a day to laugh, worship their idol, and parade the defeated enemy of Israel as entertainment. When they were in high spirits, they shouted, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." Judges 16:25. They led him from the prison into the center of the temple. Thousands watched. The rulers were there. The crowds were cheering. There were over 3,000 men and women on the roof alone, not counting those inside. They laughed at him, mocked him, celebrated their victory. But Samson had one last request. He asked the servant who guided him to let him rest his hands on the pillars that held up the temple. The boy didn't realize what was about to happen. Then Samson prayed. Not a long speech, not a dramatic performance. Just a real, broken, honest prayer. Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more. Judges 16:28. He didn't ask to live. He didn't ask for revenge out of pride. He asked to be used, one last time, for a purpose bigger than himself. He positioned his hands, one on each main pillar. He pushed. The structure began to tremble, cracks formed, the roof shifted. Then he cried out, "Let me die with the Philistines," and the temple collapsed. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. Judges 16:30. His body was later recovered by his family. They buried him in his homeland, and his time as judge over Israel came to an end. Samson died in chains, but not as a defeated man. He died as a man who finally remembered his calling, a man who finished his life in surrender to God. Sometimes the greatest victories come after the greatest failures. Maybe your story hasn't ended the way you thought it would. Maybe you've fallen hard. But Samson's final chapter reminds us, if we return to God with humility, He can still fulfill His purpose, even in our weakness. Samson's death was dramatic. The temple of Dagon collapsed. Thousands of Philistines died. His family retrieved his body and buried him. His time as Israel's judge ended with one final act of strength. But the story of Samson isn't just about power. It's about what happens when a man is strong on the outside, but broken on the inside. Samson had been chosen before birth. His identity was clear. He was a Nazirite, set apart for God's purposes. The Spirit of God had come upon him many times. He was gifted, anointed, and feared, but he was also impulsive, proud, and distracted. He could defeat armies, but couldn't control his desires. He could lift gates, but couldn't resist temptation. He could lead others, but didn't lead himself. His weakness was never physical. It was spiritual. Samson didn't lose everything in one day. His fall was gradual. He ignored his calling. He played with sin. He treated sacred things as ordinary. And over time, those small decisions led to a big collapse. This is what happens when a person trusts the gift more than the giver. When someone relies on talent but neglects character, the most dangerous place to be is thinking you're doing fine, just because things still work. Samson thought, "I've broken rules before and still won." But he didn't realize that grace is not permission to sin. It's an opportunity to return to God. Eventually the grace ran out, not because God stopped loving him, but because Samson kept choosing rebellion, until one day the Lord left him, and he didn't even know it. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Judges 16:20. That's the real tragedy, not the chains, not the blindness, but losing God's presence and not even noticing. And it wasn't because God was distant, it was because Samson had stopped listening. He surrounded himself with enemies, ignored godly wisdom, and gave his heart to someone who was never trustworthy. Why? Because like many of us, Samson believed he could handle it, that he could live close to the line and not fall, that he could manage sin instead of fleeing from it. But sin is never safe. It always takes more than it promises. It blinds, binds, and slowly grinds you down, just like it did to Samson. Still, the end of his story reminds us of something greater, that even when we've failed, even when we've lost everything, even when we're at our lowest, God can still use us if we turn back to him. Samson's strength didn't return because he deserved it. It returned because he repented, because he prayed, because he asked God for help. And that's the difference. In the end, Samson didn't die defeated. He died restored, not perfect, but surrendered. And that surrender made all the difference. When people think of Samson's downfall, they usually picture the physical chains, the ones the Philistines used to bind him in Gaza. But the truth is, Samson had been in chains long before that moment. They just weren't visible. The real chains were internal. They were chains of pride, the belief that his gift made him untouchable, chains of compromise, the small decisions that added up over time, chains of lust, the constant drive to satisfy himself rather than honor God, chains of disobedience, treating his vow as optional instead of sacred. For years, Samson operated in strength while being tied down by invisible cords, and many people today are the same. There are leaders who preach powerfully but live in secret sin. There are believers who sing about freedom while privately living in bondage. There are Christians who are admired on the outside but defeated on the inside. Samson is not just a story from the past. He's a mirror for the present. The man who once ripped lions apart was being eaten alive by his own impulses. The man who ruled in battle was a slave to his own decisions. He thought he was free because he was still functioning. But functioning is not the same as being whole. That's the danger. Just because you're still operating doesn't mean you're aligned with God. Just because you're still strong doesn't mean you're spiritually safe. For Samson, the breaking point came in a prison. He had no eyes, no freedom, no applause, no more power, just silence. But in that silence, something began to change. Not just his hair, but his heart. He realized that strength wasn't about muscle, it was about surrender. He realized that his true calling wasn't about victory in battle, but obedience to God. He realized that losing everything gave him a chance to return to what really mattered. God hadn't abandoned him. He was still watching. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Judges 16:22. That quiet verse is full of hope, not because hair has magic, but because God honors humility. Sometimes God lets us hit the bottom, not to destroy us, but to bring us back. The Philistines thought Samson was done. The crowds thought his story was over, but God was just beginning a new chapter. If you feel like you've lost everything, reputation, purpose, even the presence of God, don't give up. What matters is not how far you've fallen. It's whether you'll turn around. Samson couldn't undo the past, but he could still honor God in the present. He could still be used, even in weakness. And so can you. Samson had been humiliated, He was now blind, imprisoned and forgotten. For the Philistines, he was no longer a threat. For Israel, he was out of sight. But for God, he was not finished. The Philistine leaders organized a massive celebration. They wanted to honor their god, Dagon, for delivering Samson into their hands. It was a national holiday, a moment to mock their enemy and worship their idol. Now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god, and to celebrate, saying, "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands." Judges 16:23. Thousands gathered in the temple of Dagon. The rulers were there. The crowds filled the building. The roof alone held about 3,000 people. They were drinking, laughing, and praising their God, the same God Samson had been raised to stand against. Then they called for Samson. "Bring out Samson to entertain us," they said. Judges 16:25. So they brought him out from prison, and he stood in front of them, helpless, a blind man being mocked by those he once terrified. They didn't see a warrior. They saw a clown, a defeated man with no strength left. But Samson had been changing. In the silence, in the dark, during those long days in chains, he had come back to God, not with words, but in heart, not with strength, but with surrender. He asked the servant guiding him to place his hands on the main pillars of the temple, the two columns supporting the structure. Then Samson prayed, not for revenge, not for glory. He simply asked God to remember him. "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more." Judges 16:28. It was the most sincere moment of his life. He didn't ask to escape. He didn't ask for a second chance to live. He asked to fulfill his purpose, even if it cost him everything. He stood between the pillars. He braced himself, and he pushed. "Let me die with the Philistines," he cried out. The pillars cracked, the walls shook, the roof collapsed. The building came down on the rulers and everyone inside. Thus, he killed many more when he died than while he lived. Judges 16:30. His family came to collect his body. They buried him in his father's tomb. And with that, Samson's time as judge of Israel ended. He didn't end as a hero in the world's eyes, but in God's eyes he ended with purpose. Sometimes our greatest impact doesn't come in our peak moments, but in our final surrender. Samson wasn't defined by his fall. He was remembered for his return. And that's hope for anyone who feels like it's too late. You may have failed. You may have wasted time. But if you return to God, your final chapter can still bring glory to Him. Samson's life ended under the rubble of a pagan temple. He had no crown, no army, no grand send-off. He died surrounded by enemies, not allies, but he died in obedience. And that changed everything. The same man who had once broken vows, ignored warnings, and chased after forbidden women, was now standing between two pillars, calling on God and giving up his life to fulfill his purpose. His death was not a loss, it was his redemption. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. Judges 16:30. That one sentence tells us something critical. God can still use someone after failure. Even when others count you out, God sees the ending you haven't written yet. But Samson's story isn't just a historical event. It's a warning and a promise. It warns us about the cost of compromise. It shows us what happens when we rely on our strength and ignore God's voice. It reveals the danger of walking close to sin and assuming we'll never fall. But it also shows something else, that even when we've failed deeply, God is willing to listen if we return. In the New Testament, Samson's name shows up again, not in a list of failures, but in a list of heroes. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, Hebrews 11:32. That's right. Samson, the flawed, impulsive, broken man, is listed among the faithful. Why? Because faith is not about being perfect. It's about turning back to God, even after falling. It's about trusting Him more than yourself. It's about surrendering everything, even if it's at the end. Samson didn't live a perfect life, but he died with purpose. And that means something important. Your past doesn't have to disqualify your future. What matters is how you respond now. Maybe you've wasted time. Maybe you've walked away from your calling. Maybe you're in a spiritual prison of your own making. But you can still pray the same words Samson did. Lord, remember me, strengthen me one more time. If you say that with a sincere heart, God will hear you, and he won't just forgive you, he can still use you. Samson's story didn't end in failure. It ended in faith. Let yours do the same.